At Boise State Public Radio, we understand that not everyone is able to give financially. Did you know there are other ways you can give? We are looking for new volunteers to add to our ranks and have a variety of opportunities.
Who wants to volunteer?
If you're interested in a hands-on volunteer experience, visit our website under the Support tab to find out more at boisestatepublicradio.org.
Thank you to all the staff and volunteers who are part of Boise State Public Radio.
More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. Water is everything in the West, but who gets it and who doesn't can come down to a law that was written more than a century ago. A new investigation from Oregon Public Broadcasting and ProPublica examines how that system is leaving some farmers struggling while others continue to use plenty of water, even during drought. Oregon Public Broadcasting reporter Emily Kirton-Cook is joining us now to tell us more about her in-depth investigation. Emily, thanks so much for taking time for us today, and welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
Okay, so Emily, this story really begins with one farmer. Can you tell us about him and why his experience became the lens for your investigation?
Yeah, so there is a main character that again we start with, and his name is Chris Casad. And I actually met him and his wife, Kate Hafstad-Casad, covering water issues in the Deschutes Basin, which is one of the largest drainages east of the Cascades in Oregon. It drains a lot of the water from the Cascade Range. And the Casads were really interesting to me because they're a relatively young couple. Neither of them inherited farming. But Chris, he grew up in Bend in what he describes as this like suburban neighborhood, playing soccer and, cutting lawns was his first job. And it was through his journey of working on farms and being a volunteer and traveling around that he realized like, oh, hey, this is what I want to do for money. I want to grow food, sell it, feed people, and for that to be enough. And so he started really small outside of Bend, leasing land that relied on irrigation water from the Deschutes River. This is land that otherwise really doesn't have streams. It has some wells, but not a lot. And pretty much everything used to grow stuff is coming from this river. And so Chris Casad, he started small, like 10-acre plot, and he was very successful. And little by little, he grew his business and started growing vegetables and primarily potatoes in this region that now is not an agricultural powerhouse, but used to be a big potato growing place. And his journey then takes a turn when he gets a little bit older, really finds his footing, is getting contracts to sell his potatoes, and he wants to be able to afford his own piece of land and also not be driving hours a day between these disjointed leases in order to be a farmer. So he moves essentially downstream where he can start his own place. And he's also reliant on the Deschutes River, but his water rights are not as powerful. And so the story sort of picks up with him in this moment of the last major historic drought, learning a very hard lesson about water rights. And a thing I think a lot of people know about water rights is this idea of first in time, first in right. But where our investigation kind of goes into the law beyond that is this other foundational aspect of, as you mentioned, more than a century old water law, which is that the water needs to be put to beneficial use without waste.
Okay, so your reporting found that only about a quarter of the water diverted by the Central Oregon Irrigation District actually is used by crops. So what happens to the rest of that water?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And just to, people listening may know, some of you may be thinking, what the heck is an irrigation district? So, land farmers or landowners like Chris Casad, one of our characters, they may own the land or lease the land, but the water rights tied to it are often controlled by irrigation districts. And so when Chris lived near Bend, he was in a district with senior water rights known as Central Oregon Irrigation District. And it's one of the largest and most powerful irrigation districts in Oregon. It has the rights to divert more than half the volume of the Deschutes River in Bend. And we used state satellite data to look at how much of that water is consumed by crops. And as you know, we found that only 1 out of every 4 gallons leaving the river in wet years and dry was actually consumed by crops. As for what happens to that other 3 out of 4 gallons, that kind of exactitude is not what we studied. We did note that, most of it is percolating into the ground, evaporating into hot, dry air, draining off fields into scrubland and desert. And that means some of it is feeding the aquifer, and some of it's going back into the river downstream where environmental regulators have found waterways warmed and polluted. So, if you look at it from this macro standpoint, that water does go somewhere. But again, only 25% of what comes out of the river for this very large irrigation district is quenching crops. And we also studied, well, what are the crops? And we found almost all of that water that did reach fields was going to grass and pasture.
Okay, so one of the surprising things that I found in your reporting is, if I understood this correctly, is that state law in Oregon can treat watering like your ornamental landscaping or your pasture grass the same as growing food. So how in the world did we get here?
This is one of those bedrock concepts in Western water law. I mean, a lot of people know, basically, if you own the land with the oldest water rights attached to it, that means you're first in line for water when there isn't enough to go around. And the people behind you in line have to cut back to protect your share. That's what's known as seniority. And this concept of what you're talking about, where it doesn't matter if during those times of shortages, someone is using the water during a drought to grow food or keep a big lawn green, it's all considered beneficial under the law, so long as it's not a weed or a native plant. And what I didn't know going into this was that Oregon has never clearly defined what it means to waste water. And so that word actually became quite a trigger word. And then, within these laws, there were other aspects where we found, people had incentives. They told me over and over. I interviewed, more than 60 people for this reporting, and it came up time and again that people felt they had every incentive to use water if they want to keep their water rights, and no incentives to save water. And so we found that this really spurred people to soak in Oregon some of the state's most expensive real estate, yet least productive farmland, or risk losing the rights to that water. That's because of a law that says that if landowners aren't using the water exactly where they're supposed to, at least once every 5 years, the state can cancel the unused water rights. And, it's worth noting that this kind of a law is common across the West. And in Oregon, it's very rarely enforced. Oregon regulators have canceled irrigation water rights just 4 times since 2020. And none of those were in this irrigation district, the Central Oregon Irrigation District, which we studied. And that's in large part because COID is on top of this. Every summer, a district hired plane flies over the more than 70 square miles of its fields looking for brown patches. And if it sees them, it sends landowners these warning letters telling them to take action to protect the water rights. And the landowners I interviewed said this has the effect of incentivizing them to use water because they know it enhances their property values and it can help bring agricultural tax breaks regardless of the agricultural output of the property.
So talk to us a little bit more about this satellite data and these water records, because you spent months digging into this. When did you realize that the numbers that you got, were telling a different story than maybe what the public had been hearing or understanding?
Yeah, so the type of data we relied on, this can get very nerdy and very wonky. I will do my best. But it's what's called remotely sensed evapotranspiration. Experts I talk to sometimes call it plant sweat. Basically, if you have a green field, especially in a semi-arid area, that can be detected from space. And it's a type of imagery, basically. And so what was striking to me is that these estimates from remotely sensed satellites are actually, experts told me, the best available scientific way to measure water consumption. And that's because in Oregon, the vast majority of water use isn't measured or reported to the state with any kind of a hard metering. And that mere idea can trigger like political kryptonite, just total backlash when it comes up. So in recent years, lawmakers in Oregon invested in this workaround where they created a report drawing on this type of satellite data to estimate how much crops consumed. And we zoomed in on COID again because it's one of the largest and most powerful water rights in the state. And it's in a region that's not an agricultural powerhouse. The land there is some of the most expensive farmland in Oregon, but most of the farms are on average money losers. So just the agricultural data we were seeing was sort of at odds in many ways with what you would think with the wealth of water people were receiving.
So my understanding is that the irrigation district disputes your conclusions. So what did they tell you, and how do they explain the way the system operates?
Yeah, the Central Oregon Irrigation District, I sat down with them quite a bit, during this reporting, and officials there did reject our finding of, 1 out of every 4 gallons taken from the river being actually consumed by crops. They basically said they didn't trust the state satellite data. And their way of measuring water use is to measure not the water part, but the use part. So they are, again, with these, aerial surveys from hired planes looking at, is the land that's supposed to be green? Mm-hmm. Does it have 2 to 3 inches of a non-native crop growing on it in July, basically? So they're measuring a very different thing. And the thing they're measuring is totally rooted in how the law works and how, historically, lawmakers told me the idea was that's how people could verify, okay, my neighbor Jane is not illegally using water. She's putting water where she's supposed to. And, one of the lawmakers I talked to,
go ahead.
One of the lawmakers I talked to, called this kind of an outdated idea. Rep. Ken Helm, who's a leader of water management policy in Oregon, because he said, the satellite data is actually a better way, a more reliable way to see where water is being consumed and for what purposes. So this idea of what's called a pertinency may not be serving us the way that it was intended to back in the day that it was created. And that was one viewpoint. And back to COID, kind of rejecting our findings, we certainly took that seriously. And I did find that buried in a state report, the district's own estimates of how much its crops require based on, surveys of people about what they were growing and based on weather data. They actually closely aligned with our finding using this kind of more cutting edge type technology, in that, again, only 25% of the diversion was consumed by crops on average. That was the case during the last drought and in the wetter years before it.
So I have just under 2 minutes left with you, and I want to ask you this last question because take the numbers out of it. Your reporting also looked at the human cost. Very quickly, if you could, tell us about what farmers told you, really about the financial and the emotional toll of this repeated water shortages that they deal with.
Yeah, I think the mental impacts of water shortages on farmers really stopped me cold. Our farmer, Chris Cassad, who we were talking about in the beginning, his irrigation district is behind COID in line, but it also relies on water from the Deschutes, and it's the first to get cut back when there's drought, which there more frequently is. And, I visited with him and other farmers in Jefferson County, Oregon, and, they've long had to make do with less water. In fact, their water rights certificate promises half as much per acre, and they lose an even higher percentage in their leaky delivery canals, but they still manage to have crops consuming a higher percentage of what they take out of the river. And they really pride themselves on this efficiency and on self-reliance. And so, these are not people who want to complain, basically, is what I found when I visited them. But years of drought after drought after drought. And now there's environmental regulations that are going to take the toughest toll on this district as they're told to leave more water in the river for an endangered species. And so they're watching their neighbors or people themselves are getting driven out of business. And that's definitely led to despair.
Well, I want to thank you so much. We've been talking with Oregon Public Broadcasting reporter Emily Curitin Cook. We'll have more Idaho Matters next. You've been listening to the Idaho Matters podcast from Boise State Public Radio. To stay in touch, you can find quick Idaho Daily News every morning when you subscribe to the Connector podcast. And if this episode meant something to you, text it to a friend.
Each story you hear on Planet Money starts with a question. What happens if we refund tariffs? Why are groceries so expensive? At NPR, we stand for your right to be curious, because the forces shaping our world can be hard to see. Follow NPR's Planet Money wherever you get your podcasts and start seeing how the economy really works.